Good evening and welcome to Festivals and Food in the Roman Empire. My name is Fina. I am a late first century Romano-Briton whose persona story-wise, my father was a consul and he's now been recalled from Britain back to the Central Empire. So while I spent most of my young life growing up in Britain, I now live just outside of Pompeii. Tonight, we're going to be talking about festivals and food in the Roman Empire, just to give you kind of a brief introduction into how festivals and food in the Roman Empire correlate with each other. Also, I should point out that Roman food is, while I have many hobbies in the SCA, Roman food and Roman culinary research are my primary focus areas for geekery. It's something that I love and enjoy, and I will talk your ear off about it given the least opportunity to do so. If I am going too fast, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and slow me down. Sometimes when I get excited about a topic, I talk a little faster than normal. A couple of housekeeping issues. I have a rather large Norwegian forest cat who is firmly convinced that every Zoom class I teach is about him. And while I try very hard to keep him out of my office, he is both smarter than he needs to be and bigger than most cats, and is perfectly capable of just opening the door and letting himself in. So if by some chance you hear a cat in the background or he decides to pop up on camera, I apologize for the distraction. I do my best to keep him away when I'm teaching, but I'm not always successful. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am going to turn off my camera because the way the camera overlays on the slideshow, it makes it hard for me to see some of the things we're discussing. So I'm going to just stop my video while we're going through the slideshow so that it's easier for me to see the slides. So again, thank you for coming to the class tonight and welcome. So when you think about foods and festivals in ancient Rome, what is kind of the picture that you have? What image pops into your head? And I want you to think about that image, right? Because most of what we know about Roman history and Roman food culture, it comes from early 19th and 20th century historians, most of whom were, shall we say, a little biased about Roman culture. This is one of those classic neoclassical paintings from the Victorian era depicting what they thought Saturnalia might look like. And as you can tell, the artist clearly thought it was a very hedonistic display. While there are some elements of carnival atmosphere in some of the festivals that the Romans celebrated, I think we do them a disservice if we assume that every festival that they celebrated or practiced was some hedonistic affair like the one pictured here. So the first thing we really is how important were holidays and festivals to Roman life. There's a funny internet meme that I love to share with people that we're going to get to in just a second because I think you'll find it amusing. But first, let's talk about the importance. These things formed a major part of Roman life. They affected the conduct of business, weddings, legal proceedings, even agricultural concerns. Some even mandated days where labor was not to be performed by anyone, including members of the slave class. There was no month in the Roman year that did not feature multiple holidays and festivals. So let's take an overview of the Roman calendar. And this is where we're going to get to that fun meme that I was mentioning before. So a lot of people know that the original Roman calendar, September, October, November, and December, were the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the calendar. So the numbers matched the names of the months. I saw this a while back when I was getting ready to teach the class, and I thought it was really funny because it's talking about how that naming practice changed. So this says, I hate that September, October, November, and December aren't the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months. Whoever messed this up should really be stabbed. And the next poster, if I recall, they did used to be the corresponding months. It was just when Roman leaders Julius Caesar and Augustus came into power, the months July and August were added, thus throwing off the numbering of the calendar. And it ends with the final poster saying, "Good news though, whoever messed it up did in fact get stabbed." This is a really funny meme. Unfortunately, it's incredibly inaccurate. While the Roman calendar originally did have September, October, November, and December as the 7th, 8th, and 9th, 10th, and 10th months, the calendar change that made them move to later in the year actually occurred 152 years before the advent of Julius Caesar. The Roman calendar originally had March 1st as the beginning of the year and February as the end of the year. But an administrative action taken by the consuls of Rome in 152 BC actually changed it so that the end of the year ended in December and began in January for purely administrative reasons. So while Julius Caesar did get stabbed, and it is kind of funny that months were named after him posthumously and his nephew posthumously, they had nothing to do with the change of the dates, the names and dates of the calendars. In fact, while Augustus did change the month that we now call July to Julius from its original date, it was actually Augustus's son who changed the name of what we now call August to Augustus. So how full was the Roman calendar? Well, this is an excellent depiction. This is a replica of a Roman calendar that was found in the city of Pompeii. This is a year calendar for public holidays only, and it was painted on the inside of the home in the main central entryway of the home. On one side of the doorway was one calendar, on the other side of the doorway was a second calendar. The calendar we're looking at features only public holidays. That is, holidays that would be celebrated by every Roman citizen living in that area. The second calendar that we don't have pictured here was actually a private calendar that related only to the holidays celebrated by the family. And we'll discuss that in a little bit of detail here in just a moment. So just to give you an idea of how full the Roman calendar was, in January, there were 12 separate days on which religious or cultural festivals were celebrated. February had 15 days, March had 7, April had 20. And it's tied with Quintilius, or as we would call it later in the empire, Julius, for having 20 days in April. May has 11, June has 18, Sextilis or August has 14, September 6, October 14, November has the fewest number of holidays with having only 4, and December has 15. So the Roman calendar included 156 public festivals and holidays over the course of a 12-month year. That's nearly half of all of the days in the year that are taken up by some sort of festival or holiday. This means that 43% of the Roman calendar involved some sort of festival, holiday, or religious observance. And this number doesn't even begin to include the various ludi or games or mercatus, markets or fairs, which either occurred as part of a holiday or occurred after the conclusion of the holiday. Nor does it include any of the private holidays that were specific to certain families. So let's talk about the types of Roman festivals. So we have a number of different types of holidays and festivals that occur both in the Republican period and the imperial period of Rome. The first are the feriae privatae, then we have the feriae publicae, and the ludi. The feriae privatae were private holidays. These are specific to a family or held to honor a private individual. They are often held to mark either the births or other important lives in the members of that family, or to commemorate the 10 days of mourning after the death of a prominent member of a family. The feriae publicae were the public holidays. These formed the basis of the Roman religious calendar. They were celebrated by the vast majority of the Roman population, and many of these received some form of public funding. Lastly, we have the ludi. these were not holidays in the same sense as the Feriae Publicae or the Feriae Privatae. They were essentially games of different varieties meant to entertain the populace. These could take the form of gladiatorial games in the Colosseum, or circus activities at the Circus Maximus. And ludi were not just held in the city of Rome, but in some of the outlying provinces as well. So ludis may be specific to a region as opposed to being common throughout the entirety of the empire. What's really fascinating is that most of the ludi were also dies festae. In other words, while they weren't necessarily holidays in the traditional sense, they did allow for the average Roman to have a day off from regular duties to attend things like the circus or the Colosseum. So let's break it down a little more. And we're going to focus mostly for our purposes on the Feriae Publicae, because those are the ones that we have the most knowledge about. Of these are broken down again into 3 separate categories. The first is the conceptive, the second is the stative, and the third is the imperative. And what's important about these categories is how they reflect when a festival occurred. So let's start with the conceptive. These are annual holidays, but they have movable dates based on the calendar. So think like Thanksgiving for us, right? We always know that Thanksgiving is the 3rd Thursday in November, but it's never on the same numerical date. It's the same thing with the conceptive. These are annual holidays. They occur around the same time every year, but the specific numerical date of that holiday will change from year to year. And generally the dates of these were announced either by the priests or the magistrates who were in charge of making sure that the observances were performed. The second category were stative. These are also annual holidays, but they have fixed dates like Christmas in our modern calendar, right? Christmas always happens on the 25th of December. The same is true of the stative in the Roman calendar. These always have fixed dates. They're always going to occur on the same numerical date every year. The last category is what we call the imperative. These were not holidays that necessarily repeated. They were special celebrations or observances, and they were held by command or on demand, depending on your perspective. So just a few of the Feriae conceptive that occur in the Roman calendar. We have the Compitalia, the Sementive, the Fornicalia, the Amberbium, which is also called the Ambervalia in some locations in the Roman Empire, and the Feriae Latinae. And then we have the Feriae Stative. So there are many more holidays that have specific set dates that don't change based on the calendar. And it's quite a long list. As you can see, the majority of the Roman holidays fall under the Feriae Stative category. And the last category, the Feriae Imperative, these are irregular holidays. They only occur when they are proclaimed by consuls, praetors, or dictators during the Republican period and by the emperor or by a regent for a child emperor during the imperial period. These are often proclaimed to meet either an emergency state or to celebrate a victory. For example, Caesar's triumph in the conquering of Egypt would be one of those Feriae Imperative, right? It occurred to celebrate that he brought Egypt into the fold of the Roman Empire. While these Feriae really lasted several days, and many were held in response to some event that indicated the gods need to appease. So often these are very grim festivals as opposed to joyous occasion. One example of such a Feriae occurred in 192 BC after a 38-day series of earthquakes affected the region. The consul at the time proclaimed a series of sacrifices in an attempt to appease the gods, hoping that the earthquakes would ease and that the region could begin to rebuild from the damages that they had suffered. Again, as these were often about appeasement, the Feriae Imperative were often grim rather than festive, and they were rarely given names like we see with the Feriae Stative and the Feriae Conceptive. So that's our kind of short overview of the Roman calendar. We could go into much more detail, but we could literally talk about the Roman calendar for hours. And I really want to get to food and festival observance because I think that's a really interesting aspect of Roman festival and cultural observance. So let's talk about foods and festival observance. From our overview of the Roman calendar and the types of festivals and holidays have shown us that their calendar is literally packed with various observances, celebrations, and religious practices. In fact, there are around 47 different named ferii. Of these, there were 18 which specifically detail food or drink serving as either a part of the celebration or as an element of ritual sacrifice. That's a little more than 1/3 of all of the ferii that involve food as a central element. So now we're going to talk about the festivals in which food forms a central element. The first of these is the Compitalia. This was celebrated once a year in honor of the Lares Compitales, the household deities of the crossroads, to whom sacrifices were made at the places where two roads or paths meet. Part of this observance was to make sure that the crossroads stayed where they belonged. And so people would carry food out to the crossroads in the form of sacrificial cakes called libums that would be presented by the inhabitants of each house to appease the Lares Compitales and make sure that the place of the crossroads never changed. And this was celebrated a few days after the Saturnalia.
No, this is Wolf.
And then we have the Fornicalia. This one is one of my favorite festivals. This was literally the Feast of Ovens, and it was related to the proper baking of bread. It was celebrated in honor of the goddess Fornax, who was considered to be the divine personification.
Are we back? We lost you for a moment.
Yep, somebody muted me.
Glad you're back.
Okay, so the Fornicalia was celebrated in honor of the goddess Fornax, and she was considered to be the divine personification of the oven. What's interesting about this is how the offerings were brought. So each section of the city was divided into a curia. Kind of a way to think about it as neighborhoods, but much larger neighborhoods than we would consider to be a neighborhood in the modern sense. So large sections of the city are divided into these curias, and in each curia there is a central hall that anyone in the curia can have access to. And during the Feast of the Fornicalia, members of the curia on the date specified by the leader of their curia would bring an offering of far to be toasted in the oven of the hall of the curia. This sacrifice was meant to ensure that bread in the ovens wouldn't be burnt over the course of the year. This was really important to the Romans, as one of the rights of Roman citizenship was to be entitled to a share of bread at the expense of the empire. And it was specifically a right of Roman citizenship. It wasn't given to people who just lived within the empire. You had to be a citizen in order to be entitled to this bread ration. The final day of the festival was called the Quirinalia, or the Feast of Fools, and this also involved a public feast. So the reasoning behind the Quirinalia is, in the later parts of the imperial period, the city had grown to such a massive extent that some people didn't know which curia to which they belonged. So if you didn't know which curia to which you belonged, it was hard to take your offering of far to your curia hall and burn it in order to meet the sacrifice. So on the last day of the Fornicalia, you could take your far to any hall of the Curia, even if it wasn't yours, and burn your festival offering. It became to be called the Quirinalia because people who didn't know which Curia to which they belonged were often made a little bit of fun of and called fools. And so it's the beginning of the Feast of Fools for the Roman Empire. But it also involved a public feast that was provided at the expense of the city. So after you took your final offering on the last day, you would go out and enjoy a feast at the expense of the city, usually hosted by the leader of whoever your curia was, and enjoy a public meal together with other people who lived in your section of the city. And then, let's see. The next is the Feriae Latinae. So this festival actually predates the founding of the city of Rome. This festival was observed to commemorate and reaffirm the alliance of the 30 settlements and tribes of the Latium region that was organized for mutual defense. Even in the days of the latter empire, during the festival, representatives from each of the original settlements would come to the city and would bring offerings of agricultural products like sheep, cheese, and grain. The currently presiding consul of Rome would then make a libation of milk before sacrificing a pure white heifer. As part of the sacrifice, the flesh of the heifer would then be cooked and would be served as a part of the communal meal in which all of the members of the representative settlements and the consul and most of the people attending the festival would have a chance to eat. This one is really unique because it's one of the few times where we see the eating of beef as part of a Roman festival. Usually when we see communal meals during festivals, they involve different herd animals. The next festival is one of great importance to the Romans, as it was a 9-day festival held to honor the family ancestors. It's called the Parentalia. This has some overtones of a festival of the dead with elements of ancestor worship built into it. The offerings included flower garlands, emmer wheat, salt, wine-soaked bread, and violets left at family tombs. It was meant to strengthen the ties between the departed ancestors and the living family, and to implore the ancestors to work on behalf of their living family. In addition to the offerings and sacrifices that were made, the families often shared cake and wine, both in the form of offerings and as a meal among themselves while visiting the tombs of their ancestors. The Christia follows hard on the heels of the Parentalia, and depending on which scholars you read and which poets you read from the Roman period, it was seen by some to be the last day of the Parentalia festival. This festival, however, was focused on strengthening the bonds of the living family members. It primarily was celebrated with gifts of wine and bread and sportulae between the family, but it also featured a family gathering where all the family members who were present would dine together, as well as make offerings of food and incense in the home to the Lares, the household gods. The Lupercalia was originally observed as a ritual purification of the city, but it was also intended to promote fertility and health. The celebrations included both animal sacrifices. In this case, only male animals were allowed to be sacrificed, and an offering of mola salsa, which is a special salted flour meal cake that was prepared annually by the Vestal Virgins. Lupercalia is one of those interesting festivals where in some texts it's related to the worship of Lupa, who rescued Romulus and Remus. In other texts, you'll find no reference to her with regard to the festival at all. But after the sacrifice, there was a sacrificial feast at which the Luperci, the priests of the Lupercalia, would hand out food, and then once they had eaten their fill, they would run around the Palatine Hill, striking women on the hand with leather thongs. The purpose of this was that it would hopefully either promote fertility or guarantee a successful delivery if the woman who was struck was already pregnant. Next, we have the Terminalia. This is celebrated in honor of the god Terminus, who was the god of boundaries. It was often considered to be, for the most part, a rural festival, as owners of adjacent properties met at their property lines and built a rough altar to the god, at which they would make offerings of wine, honeycomb, grain, as well as sacrificing either lambs or suckling pigs. In the later part of the Republican period and the early Imperial period, you see a public part of this festival beginning to be celebrated at the 6th milestone on the road to Rome. Again, you would see sacrifices, but also a feast that would take place in this area. Prior to the calendar, I clicked too soon. Prior to the calendar change that was made to make December the last month of the year, this was also the recognition of the change of the year, as it marked the boundary between one year and the next, as Terminalia was celebrated on the last day of February. Remember, in the original Roman calendar, the end of February ended the year and the 1st of March began the new year. The Liberalia is a twofold festival. It was honored to Liber Pater, god of wine and fertility, and his consort Libera. And the priestesses of Liber Pater would dedicate to the god, again, libum, which is that honey cake we talked about before, and it would be sacrificed on behalf of worshipers. It was also during this feast that boys who had reached the age of adulthood, according to Roman practices, would lay aside the garments of childhood and don the toga virilis. The toga virilis signaled to all who saw them that they had come into adulthood and that they were now citizens of Rome and able to claim all the rights of citizenship, amongst and including these, the right to vote. We also have the Faunalia Rustica. This festival actually happened just a couple of days ago. It was the festival to honor Faunus, who was the god of flocks, fields, and forests. And it was primarily a rural festival. Again, it involved offerings of food and wine, which were brought to the sacred groves dedicated to Faunus, and it frequently featured dancing and feasting as part of the celebration as well. Next, we have the Perilia. This is another one of the agricultural festivals. It was primarily dedicated to the purification of both the shepherds and their sheep. This festival had many parts, and they had to be performed in a specific order. And there's something like 26 different parts of this. So I'm going to give you the quick overview, because it would take a long time to go through each and every one of the parts. So it initially began with the bonfire, which the shepherd had to collect deadfall. He couldn't cut any fresh wood for this. It had to be deadfall branches to build his bonfire. Once the bonfire had reached a great height, the shepherd was to leap through with his sheep to purify himself. After leaping through the fire, he would then make a sacrifice of milk, millet, and cakes to Peleus, the patron god of sheep and shepherds. And then he would drink Veronica. So Veronica is an interesting mixture of sapa, which is a boiled wine that's very thick and syrupy, and then is mixed with fresh milk. And it's also a very potent alcoholic mixture. So don't think of it as a wine content of alcohol. Think of it more as a spirit level of alcohol, probably in the neighborhood of some scotches or whiskeys that you might have had. So it's very potent. And then after consuming the Veronica, the shepherd is then to jump through the fire 3 more times. I think from my perspective, this seems like it would be a really complicated task to perform after drinking the Veronica, because again, it's a very potent alcoholic mixture. And I think that there might be some trouble with stability on the jumping. In later years, the elements of this festival, especially in urban areas like the city of Rome itself, or even in places like Neapolis, would be combined with other festivals which occurred around the same time of year. And instead of being celebrated directly by the people, it would be celebrated by the priests of the god instead. During the time of Julius Caesar, it was converted into a celebration of the birth of the city of Rome itself, and games were added to the celebration in addition to a public feast provided at the expense of the city. Then we have the Lemuria. This is the second festival of Rome that is dedicated to the dead, but this one is a little darker than the Parentalia. As opposed to the Parentalia, which was about strengthening the ties with departed ancestors, this one was specifically observed to appease the restless spirits of the dead, as well as to expel any evil spirits that might be taking residence in your home. The spirits were first offered beans by having the beans cast out the door in front of them to appease them, and then they were driven from the home by the owner of the home, banging bronze pots together and yelling for the spirits to leave. It was also at this time that the Vestal Virgins prepared the mola salsa, that salted malt flour meal cake, which we talked about before, that was used in various rituals and sacred observances throughout the year. The importance of it being, of the mola salsa being made at this time is because it's made from the first wheat of the year. Next, we have the Volturnalia. Volturnus is the god of the Tiber River. He was also considered to be the god of the fountains. Volturnalia was celebrated to honor him, and also some believe his daughter Yaturnus, who was goddess of a spring from which the Romans received much of their drinking water. They were honored with games at the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus, as well as drinking of wine and public feasting. We have the Mediternalia, which is one of several wine festivals. This one is specifically to honor the new vintage of wine. During this festival, libations of new wine were offered to the gods. And it is on this day that Romans began drinking new wine by mixing it with the old. Part of this was because they believed that they couldn't drink the new wine straight because the first of the new wine had to go to the gods entirely. Also because they believed mixing new wine with old wine would bring about healing properties. This was followed closely by the Epulum Jovis. Jove was celebrated at this festival with a decadent ritual feast. All of the gods were formally invited, and statues of them would be arranged in couches in places of highest honor in the dining room of Jove's temple. During the feast, the Epilones, the priests whose jobs it was to arrange and carry out the ritual, would serve the finest of foods to the statues of the gods. And then, as the gods were unable to appear in person to eat the food, and it would be rude to leave the food, they would stand in as proxies for the gods and eat all of the decadent offerings that were placed before the statues. Then we have the Larentalia. The scholars debate whether this festival was celebrated to honor the Lares, which were the household deities, or to honor Acca Larentia, the nurse of Romulus and Remus, who were the founders of Rome. Regardless of who it was meant, the festival was celebrated by making offerings of food to the dead. This is the third festival of the dead that the Romans have. And these offerings were usually made at the altar dedicated to Acca Larentia, which would seem to give some sway to the idea that Acca Larentia was the person originally meant to be honored by the feast festival. This was followed closely by the Brumalia. This was a winter solstice festival. And again, it was meant to honor Saturn and Ceres. This is only one of four festivals where multiple gods are honored at the same time. And usually it's a consort relationship when you have a god and a goddess being celebrated together. The celebrations primarily involved drinking, evening feasting, and generally having a good time. Cicero himself complains about the celebrations of Brumalia and says that everything is decadence and overindulgence and isn't particularly Roman. But then he goes on to tell you about the feast, about how he's attending the evening feasting at one of his friend's house, and he expects to be well wined and dined. Venalia, the Venalia actually has two forms, the Venalia Urbana and the Venalia Rustica. These are, again, Roman wine festivals. During the Vinalia Urbana, the first grapes were picked and the first pressing was blessed, after which a sacrifice was made to Jupiter to ensure the growing and ripening of the grapes. Also, Jupiter was offered a libation of the previous year's sacred wine. During the Vinalia Rustica, this festival was to celebrate the growth of vegetables as well as the grape harvest, and it was during this time that vineyards and gardens were dedicated to Venus in the hopes of guaranteeing their fertility. This also featured libations of wine. Lastly, we have the Festival of the Saturnalia. This was a multi-day festival occurring in September, celebrated in honor of the god Saturn. It typically began with a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn, but the majority of the observances centered around public celebrations. These included a convivium publicum, a public banquet, held at the expense of the city, to which every person living within the city was entitled to attend, an exchange of presents, although these exchanges were often done in private and they involved things that might be considered gag gifts or even figurines called sigillaria, and a host of private parties. We have records of people attending private parties at all kinds of places during Saturnalia. In addition, there was an almost carnival-like atmosphere to the festival that included a relaxation of Roman social norms. For example, gambling, which was actually forbidden under Roman law as a general rule, was permitted during the Saturnalia and only during the Saturnalia. Not that the Romans didn't break that rule all the time, but the Saturnalia was the one time of the year that it was publicly permissible to gamble. It also involved a role reversal, which took place in which masters served their slaves or lower status freedmen at the table. It also involved a person called the King of Saturn. This person was elected to serve in the position, and their job was to provide over the festivities of the Saturnalia, as well as to give orders for the revelers to follow. This sounds rather like our modern Feast of Fools, where we have someone who's chosen to give silly orders to people attending the festival. So that's a really short deep dive into the festivals that involve food. Do you guys have any questions about what we've covered so far? Okay. So let's talk about what foods were part of the festivals. So there's two questions I really think we need to ask about foods as part of festivals. What were known festival foods and what were plausible festival foods? So let's talk about the known festival foods first. We know from writings, both from the elite and upper classes, as well as the priests class, and the poets of the time, that these foods that we're about to talk about were absolutely served as part of the festival, either as part of ritual sacrifice, as part of ritual feasting that took place. So first we have our libum. These are our honey cakes. Grain in many different forms features as part of the festival. So we have bar, millet, emmer, wheat. And we also have things like milk, cheese, wine, bread, honeycombs, whole beans, mola salsa, which is a particular type of salted flour cake, grapes, dormice feature as part of festival foods, wine-soaked bread. And in one particular festival, we also have beef in the form of a sacrificial heifer, who is then cooked and consumed as part of the festival. So if these are our known foods, what might be plausible festival foods? We know that feasts and communal meals featured as part of these celebrations. So what did the Romans eat for meals? Chances are, if they ate it at home, there's a chance that it may have featured as part of a family or communal feast option, much as our foods do today, right? We wouldn't hesitate to have chicken for dinner. We might also serve chicken as a roast chicken as part of a as a festive meal, right? The same thing is going to be happening with the Romans. While we can expect some variation in foods eaten between classes, especially with exotic ingredients, recent archaeological evidence and research indicates that citizens across all social castes had access to a wide array of food items, as well as a nutritional and diverse diet. Additionally, we need to keep in mind that unlike us, Romans were seasonal eaters. So the foods they would have available for feasting would have been dictated by what the season the festival occurred in. So they're not going to eat apples when they're out of season. They're not going to eat grapes when they're out of season. They're going to be focused on foods that are readily available to them based on the season that they're in when they're choosing a festival menu. So here's some examples of foods that were either specifically mentioned or might have been plausible foods. First, we have our libum. These are the honey cakes. When I originally tested this recipe, I did it with drained ricotta. It also works really well with a soft goat cheese. What you do want to be aware of is whatever cheese you use, you don't want to use too hard of a cheese. And I encourage you to experiment because we don't know exactly what kind of cheese it was. So all cheeses are plausible at this point if they would have existed in period. But if you choose a wet cheese, make sure you drain any excess liquid off. Otherwise, you're going to get a batter as opposed to a soft dough. And it's clear from the instructions in Cato that it was meant to be a dough because he talks about the dough being shaped. We know peas and beans featured as festival foods, and this was something that would have been available throughout the year because they could have either been eaten fresh or they could have been eaten from dried storage. So I've included a recipe for a pea or bean dish. I've done this with chickpeas, with lentils, with fava beans. It works well with most, although I will say if you try this with regular peas or lentils, you're going to get more of a mushy kind of paste option. Whereas if you do this with chickpeas, which are my particular favorite, or with fava beans, the beans are going to hold their shape a little better. We have carote frite, which is fried carrots. In Apicius, which this recipe comes from, carrots and parsnips are interchangeably used as the same word. So you're safe to do this with either carrots or parsnips based on your preference. And then this is pulima oxysomum. This is chicken with a piquant sauce. Again, this is a dish that would have been available to most Romans throughout the year. Chicken being one of the things that we have heavy evidence of consumption for in the Roman Empire, based on finds from cesspits and sewers. And then no festival meal is complete without something sweet to eat. And so we have dulcia domestica. We do know that dates were heavily imported into the empire, and we have archaeological findings to suggest that not only were they eaten by the wealthy upper classes, but based on findings from Herculaneum and Pompeii, we know that people in the middle and lower classes to a certain extent had the ability to purchase dates and eat them at home. If you're following true Roman culinary practices, you'd want to finish off your meal with cheese because they believe cheese closed off the meal and closed off the stomach. But I will leave to your discretion what kind of cheese you'd like to eat. So I come back to this every time I talk about this class and talk about Roman festivals. We had that image of the Roman celebration at the beginning, right? Which is mostly informed by neoclassical artists in the Victorian period of all Roman celebrations being sort of quasi orgies where anything goes, so to speak. I don't think that's an accurate image. Is it possible that some celebrations went to that extent? Sure, absolutely. I think it's entirely possible that in some places and in some homes, it went exactly to that extent. But I think that the more accurate image of a Roman festival would be something like this. a family or a family group or friends gathered together to share a festive meal while they celebrated their festivals. And the meal they ate might have looked something like this. Does anybody have questions?
Will copies of the recipes that you posted come along with the screenshots of the slides?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
The recipes that you posted. I'm
The,
particularly interested in
recipes
slides.
are included in the handout that
That's what I
that
want.
is in the bicranial bear.
Thank you.
Your
And they-
mice.
I have a question. Dame Joanna here. So when you are creating your feast for an event, do you create or recreate a specific feast? Do you have a favorite feast, or do you just gather elements that you like from all the feasts?
So most of the descriptions that we have of feasts come from the poets, and some of them are incredibly extravagant. Macrobius describes one feast that was held by Julius Caesar that included more than 27 dishes. Although it sounds like fun to recreate Caesar's festive meal, I think that might be going a little overboard for an SCA feast. One of the things that I try to take into consideration when I'm planning a feast is, in my attempt to be as historically accurate as possible, I try to make the feast seasonal to when I'm holding it. So I'm looking at recipes that would have been used at that time of year. For example, the feast that I just did this last Saturday, it included mushrooms, which at this time of year in Rome, it would have been the last of the mushrooms before they were gone off for the winter. It included squash, it included parsnips, it included meat. It also included a lentil and root vegetable stew, because those are the kind of foods they would have eaten at this time of year. So I try to make the feasts seasonal to the time of year that it's being planned, in keeping with how the Romans would have eaten. Other than that, I just try to pick things that sound like they go together. Apicius doesn't give us a lot of examples of what goes together. Pliny talks about food, but he doesn't talk about feasts in terms of giving us specific menus. The only people who really do are the poets, and some of their menus are satirical, and some of them are so over the top you have to question if it's not a writer's prerogative towards sleights of fancy. But there's one feast that Horatio talks about that I'm interested in recreating, because he's talking about it as a feast between friends of the same class. And as a poet, he would have been in that more middle class section of society. And so he talks about lettuce and eggs and fish forming part of the courses. And so I'd like to recreate that one, because that one seems actually reasonable and doable to recreate.
That's so cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So I have a question.
Yes.
How did this go down in the colonies?
So that's really interesting. Romans have this habit of, if they decide they like something, it's automatically Roman, and they take it with them wherever they go. So we do see some adoption in the provinces and the colonies of Roman food practices, but we also see some holding on to, even as the Romans come in, some holding on to of cultural food items. You'll find beef as a much more common food item in Roman Britain than you will find in the Germanic provinces or the North African provinces or the Central Empire. In the Central Empire, beef as a food thing is a rare item, not because there weren't beef animals around, but because in the Central Empire, animals that could be used for beef consumption were typically working animals, right? So they were much
Right,
more
so that's-
valuable. They were much more valuable as working animals than they were as food, and would only be used as food at the end of their working life.
So in Britain, in Roman Britain, you'd still find butter and beer, which you wouldn't find in.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you'll find butter and beer. So it's the butter olive oil margin, right? So there's a point at which even in Italy, butter is more common than olive oil, and it has to do with the climate of the region in where the food is made. Butter exists in the Roman period, but it's not common because most of the Roman Central Empire is still on that olive oil, but the further north you go, the more likely it is to be butter, although there is evidence of olive oil being imported from the Central Empire to the provinces. But you're still going to find butter in those outlying provinces where it's really cold. The other thing that you'll find is that, again, beer is much more common in Britain and in the Germanic provinces, where you have Romano-Britons and Germanic Romans drinking beer, especially in like tavern settings, but wine is the preferred social status item. So if you're having a really high class social status meal, you're more likely to serve your guests wine. Whereas if it's in private and you're not worried about making a big splash, you're more likely to drink beer.
Can I ask one more question?
Absolutely.
The Roman army, how do you have any information on how they would have, in the sense of the legions and such, in the colonies, were they doing official festivals? Did they have festivals that were unique to them? You know, either to the army or to the particular legios,
So
or legia?
the Roman Empire in general, and the Roman Legion in particular, is incredibly multiculturally diverse.
Right.
The Romans love to adopt other people's gods and say, "Oh no! It's always been Roman. It's not Greek, it's Roman. It's not Persian, it's Roman." So we do have evidence of the worship of Pomona in Roman Britain, usually associated around Roman settlements, and a lot of Roman settlements grow up as adjuncts to legions. So it would be plausible to say that the legions bring the ritual influence, and it stays because you start to build elements of Roman society around the legion forts. As things specific to them, Mithrax was one of the gods that was really specific to some of the legions. We definitely see Mithras worship in Roman Britain, in Roman German areas. So yeah, they're totally bringing some of those specific gods with them.
Well, I know we have like Syrian centurions and legionnaires in Roman Britain. The Syrians and I think Sarmatians.
We have Syrians, we have Sarmatians, we have North Africans, all in Roman Britain. We have evidence for all of that in Roman Britain.
That is so cool. And they didn't have any particular like military only holidays or traditions that involved.
If they did, they're not well written about.
Gotcha.
And that's part of our problem, right? Like these are the festivals I can absolutely say existed and happened. Are they all
Right.
of the festivals? Probably not, because we know the worship of Pomona was a really big thing. We have writings in Roman Britain about festivals dedicated to Pomona, but we have nothing from the Central Empire. But I can't believe that there weren't festivals to Pomona, but she was a goddess of apples, right, and orchards.
Right.
So she's going to be predominantly a goddess of an agricultural atmosphere. And there's probably dozens of agricultural festivals that were never written about that we don't know about.
Right.
These are just the ones we know about. I think based on how tied Romans were to different gods throughout their cultural year, I think it would be safe to say that there's probably dozens of festivals, dozens of more festivals that exist that we just don't have any remaining written documentation for.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Lori, do you have a question?
Yeah, did Romans have apple pies, and did they give them, did they eat them at Pomona's festival?
They had pie-like things. I don't think that they're not exactly pies like we think of them. But they definitely have some pastries type elements. I haven't found a recipe for apple pie, but I haven't been looking for it either. We have things like patinas, which are kind of egg custards, and some of them feature fruit. I know there's an apricot patina. I believe that there is an apple patina, but the patinas are often crustless. That'd be close.
It would. All right. Well, I kind of asked it on the basis that it seemed like that would be a very nice thing at an apple festival, would be to have lots of apple pie. But I guess cinnamon was very expensive back then.
Cinnamon doesn't feature that much in Roman cooking, actually. So that, I mean, you get a lot of things baked with honey. Like and some things aren't even baked with sweet. The sweet is added later. For example, the libum, you bake the entire cake and you don't sweeten the dough at all. All of the sweetness comes from placing the hot libum in warm honey when you take it out of the oven and letting it cool that way, and it absorbs the honey into the cake.
Oh, wow, that's really cool. I'd love to see more about the recipes for that.
And the Dulcia Domestica, it's dates, but it's one of those Roman juxtapositions of flavors. You have the sweet, chewy dates, but they're stuffed with pine nuts that have been rolled in pepper. And then they roll the dates in salt before frying them in warm honey. So there's a lot of in Roman food in general, there's a lot of this mixture of the sweet with the savory, the sour with the sweet. I told this to somebody else in a class I was teaching the other night about Roman food. In terms of a flavor profile, Roman food has much more in common with modern Indian cuisine than it does with modern Western European cuisine. So you're going to get a lot of that umami. You're going to get a lot of that mixture of sweet and sour, sweet and sour and salty, and it's a delicate balance. Getting it just right, because if you go too far into the sour, it's inedible. If you go too far into the salty, it's inedible. So it is often a delicate balance, and when I'm cooking and when I'm testing recipes, I'm doing it with minute amounts to make sure that I'm testing it right. Because the first time I did the chickpea recipe, I was like, oh, it's supposed to be like a sauce, and I used a large quantity, and I took one bite and I threw everything out, because the flavor profile of the chickpeas can be overpowering if you use too much. So if you go back and look at the chickpea recipe, actually, let's do that. Let's go look at the chickpea recipe. If I can get my screen to cooperate here. See, it's gonna think on me. So the chickpea recipe, we're talking about, in terms of how much chickpeas we're cooking, a very small amount of the flavor ingredients, only half a teaspoon of asafoetida, only 2 tablespoons of liquid cumin, only 1 1/3 tablespoons of carolinum. These things all have strong, powerful flavors on their own. And when I realized that it was more like a dressing than a sauce, and that I could cut back my portions, it literally takes less than 4 tablespoons to completely dress the chickpeas and for them to have a wonderful umami taste. And if you put any more on it of any one of those things, it would upset the balance and everything would taste awful.
What's carolinum?
Carolinum is a grape syrup that's made from must. So must is the first pressing of the grapes before it's fermented. So they take off some of that must and they boil it down till it's 1/3 of the original volume. And it's this really thick grape syrup.
Interesting. So fish sauce, essentially, liquamen,
Yep.
boiled grape juice, and something that is the East Indian variation of garlic, because it's not a plant.
So asafoetida comes from the plant hings, which is a member of the fennel family. It kind of smells, we call it the funky spice in my house because it has a definite aroma to it. It kind of smells like a combination of onion and garlic, but when you put it in things, it has the most amazing flavor, as long as you don't get carried away.
Thank you for the explanation. And we can get these recipes to try them how exactly?
So they are available in the handout that was in the Bicranial Bear. All of these recipes are also available on my website.
Okay, the handout would be way back in the beginning of the
Chat.
It's at the very top in chat.
very top.
Very top.
Okay, one
I will
moment.
also be putting a link for the bicranial in the comments section, discussion section under this event, which will stay on our baronial site. So if you go back and revisit this event, in that discussion area will be the recording of tonight, as well as the link for the bicranial bear and the handouts. Well, the handouts are in the bicranial bear.
I can't find the recipes in the chat, so maybe I came in late. I did come in a little late.
That's okay. She's gonna post the link in the event. In the Bicranial Bear, there's also a link to my website. You can find them on my website, which is also at the bottom of the screen just now. And again, if people think of questions afterwards, I'm happy to answer questions. You can always email me, or there's a contact me button through my website that will send me an email. Because I could seriously talk about Roman food all day long, and I don't want to get carried away with you guys.
I have a
Thank you.
question.
Yes.
With the quantity of festivals was kind of my fun fact for the night from your talk. More than half the days, calendar days in a year, are festivals. This seemed more to me like the medieval saints' days, because you can't take off half the days in a year and still have a functioning society. People have to still produce things and work.
Right.
So,
and not all festivals mandated days of rest.
right. That's why I'm kind of analogizing it to the saints' days in the medieval and Renaissance world. Where
No, I think that's a great analogy. I mean, we didn't even go over all of the dedication days of the temples, which would add to that, right? Because each temple has its own dedication day. So I think that's a fantastic analogy relating it to the saints' days, because while you have some days where, no work is you're mandated, no work, no business, no weddings. For the most part, it was, oh, hey, let's do the observance and get back to work, right? Which is just what the saints' days were.
right.
So the asafoetida, I've seen it recommended as the substitute for sulfium.
Yes. So in the text of the period, you will find two references, one to laser and one to Parthian laser. Laser is basically what they called silphium when it was reduced to its resin, which is what they put in as the spice. They ground up the resin and they put it in the spice. The Romans loved silphium so much that they ate it to extinction before the end of the 1st century. Parthian laser was considered to be of similar flavor but lesser quality. And asafoetida, also called king, is believed to be the Parthian laser.
Okay.
Towards the end of Apicius, towards the early parts of Apicius, you'll see laser and Parthian laser. The later you get in the Apicius recipes, the ones that they think come from the 3rd and 4th century, you'll see no more references to laser. It's just Parthian laser. And that's because by that period, silphium has become extinct. They never were able to figure out how to cultivate silphium. Silphium grew as a wild plant in North Africa. And once they ate it to extinction, they were pretty much stuck with Parthian laser. Basil, do you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to know just where on the website. Only I just checked the website and I can't get on it because I don't have today's or this week's browser. So I have no way to get the handout unless you have it somewhere else.
Yes, it's not. I'm gonna put it up on my website as well, and my website is displayed on the graphic below you. But let me grab it and put it in chat as well. I'm gonna stop share.
And if worse comes to worse, this is Emma Haldane. We can exchange email addresses on Discord, and I can make sure you get the PDF. So if this doesn't work, we've got a backup.
Okay.
The handout, by the way, is in the bicranial bear. So when you go to that at the very top of the chat, when you click that, you'll go to the archive section of the Barony of Adiantum's website, and then you have to click on December bicranial bear.
Okay, I may not be very good at this because I don't understand any of that. All I know is that I can get to her website by pasting the link. So I see
I copied the link. It will not let my browser into that website.
Medieval Test Kitchen Research. Let me see. Okay. Below you will find links to my research and presentations. Okay, I can see it. You can't, I guess, but I can. Okay.
What browser are you using?
Basil, I'll put my email address in chat, and you can email me, and I'd be happy to email you a copy of the handout.
Oh, good. I like this. You have cheese making. Hooray.
Yes.
I want to learn about cheese making. So let's go to the chat. And this is your email, finamac@live.
Yep, that's me.
And thank you, Fina. This is wonderful. This is fun. I just barely got back into the house from dashing around all over the place after my busy day. And I'm sorry, I did actually fall asleep during part of it, which is also why I want to kind of review it.
It's okay. It's a lot of material to go through in a short amount of time.
And it's Barony of Adiantum, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the website it's going to be on. Good. Thank you. I had
Jessica, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I had my cats trying to lick the bag with the marinade and the steak strips in it because they could smell it, but they couldn't.
Mine was trying to be grumpy at the start of it, but he's gone and laid down in his bed now. Thank you all for coming. Again, if you have questions you think of later, I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. If we're already friends on Facebook, you can just drop me a line via private messenger, or you can email me at my email address, which is in the chat, or like I said, you can go to my website and hit the contact me button, and I will be happy to chat with you that way. Jessica, I'm going to drop my mundane name in the chat, and that's how you can find me on Facebook.
I think you're already a friend on my Facebook, but I'm sure I'll figure it out.
But we're already friends, Lori.
All right, well, I will see you guys later because I would like some steak to go with my sadly non-existent Roman food, which I will think about while I am cooking my steak.
It's Laura, right? Not Luara. I'm just
Laura.
asking. It is Laura. Oh,
It's
okay.
Laura. Yep.
Cool. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Anya, it would be under
Thank
the
you, Fina.
recipe section of my website.
Thank you,
Ooh,
Fina. This was
recipe.
amazing.
Thank
Yeah, it
you
was
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
I feel
you.
like
It was
this is
wonderful.
absolutely exactly what the SCA is supposed to do. Educate us, inspire us, and make us want to do more. So now I know so much more about Roman stuff than I did before tonight. And I feel like I could go make a Roman feast just by having listened to you. I know that's extreme, but just like you made me feel confident in that possibility. So thank you.
You're welcome. Like I want Roman food to be accessible because I love medieval food in general, and I've made stuff other than Roman, but Roman is my passion because it's amazing. And I think everybody sees the weird ingredients in Roman food and goes, oh, I can't make that. But really, it's so much more accessible than we think it is. And if I can convince one person to try Roman food, then my whole day is made. So that works.
So I have a silly question, Fina. Dormice.
Dormice. Do you want to see pictures? I have
I'm
pictures.
just dying to know how one serves a dormouse.
Dormice?
Yes. So we'll start with what they look like when they're still warm and fuzzy.
You were prepared for my silliness.
I am, because dormice, everybody asks me about dormice, and I love to talk about the dormice. So they don't really look like mice. They look more like a cross between a mouse and a squirrel.
Kind of like a bush baby.
Right. So this is a dormouse. They are still actually served in parts of northern Italy, in places like the Czech Republic and Serbia. So it is still possible to go places and get commercially prepared at restaurants, dormice. Not in the United States. They're not considered commercially acceptable as food in the United States. So this is our friendly neighborhood dormice, and
They're about the size of a squirrel, right?
What?
About the size of a squirrel?
Just a little bit smaller than our American gray squirrels. So this is what dormice look like when they're cooking.
So a bit like
this
a
is
bit
just
like
one
guinea
of
pig.
the ways that dormice can be served.
Ew.
Yeah. So the Romans have recipes for stewed dormice. That's what these are. They're being cooked in a broth, basically. But they have other recipes where they're actually stuffed with mincemeat and cheese.
Oh my.
I will say, because I've been to northern Italy and I've had dormice, they don't actually taste that bad. If you can get over the look of the dormouse and the fact that it takes a ridiculous amount of effort to prepare a dormouse for cooking. To use an old cliched hackneyed phrase, they taste a lot like chicken.
I was going to say, it's kind of like cooking chicken. I don't want to cook my chicken where it still has its head on it either, or its feet.
Yeah. But it's actually really tender meat, and most of the places that still serve dormice are fed on high protein grain sort of diet. Here, since we're doing pictures, let's see a dormice jar too. So this is one that was recovered from Pompeii. It's mostly intact. What you can't see from this picture is what the interior of the dormice jar looks like. And basically there's little ramps built into the sides of the interior of the dormice jar. So the dormice can run up and down the ramps, and up at the top where this little lip is, there's a tray for holding food. So you take the top off of your dormice jar, you pour the food in the little tray, and the dormice run up the little ramps and come and eat the food.
Okay.
Seems a bit like the guinea pigs that you have in the Americas.
Yeah, I mean it's close. Like I said, they're kind of like a cross between a mouse and a squirrel.
In protein, you can grow at home.
And protein you could grow at home.
Anya posted that she had just created a dish that, if you read it in the chat, she says, "I'm laughing. We made meatballs stuffed with mince and cheese and then gave them clove eyes and almond whiskers."
When I recreated the dormice recipe, I did it with chicken thighs. Because I was fairly certain that if I made it look too much like a dormouse, people would run screaming from the room.
Tastes like chicken.
Speaking of Anya, you asked about the recipes. They are on the recipe collection page of my website. So if you go under the Medieval Test Kitchen and go down to recipe collections, there's four Roman recipes up there already. There's a video of me cooking the four of the recipes that are included in the handout. So you can actually see me prepare it. And if you scroll down, there's recipes from some other feasts as well. I am rewriting my Roman cookbook, so I've taken it down temporarily. So there's just a small collection of Roman recipes up while I'm rewriting the Roman cookbook.
So
And I took it down because our understanding of Roman cookery from when I originally wrote my Roman cookbook 8 years ago has changed. So I'm updating the recipes to match what we currently know about Roman cookery.
So based on what you know at this point, aside from dormice, what might be some meals or dishes that were commonly prepared that we would go, oh, aside from dormice?
Wait a
Snails.
minute. Wait a minute.
So
You're cutting
one
out,
of
Dave.
the
Go ahead.
I gotta go before you talk about those things.
Try again, Dame J. We kind of lost you. I think she froze. She'll be back.
Lucanian sausages. And the reason the Lucanian sausages are kind of ew. Okay, we all know what sausage is made of and we know what the casing is made of, but Lucanian sausages were usually cooked and then put back in the pig and served from the pig on the table. So when you pull them out of the pig, they kind of look like intestines.
Okay, you.
Right?
Definitely.
And
they found this an attractive, appetizing thing to do.
Romans liked, we think of subtleties being something that the medieval and Renaissance people were really into, but the Romans liked them too. Some of the names of the food are off-putting and then you serve them to people and they're like, oh, well, that's not bad. Like there's one dish in Apicius that's called placenta. if you assume that it means, actually placenta, that can be a little off-putting, but it doesn't actually mean placenta.
What is that one?
It's an egg dish,
Which is sort of a placenta,
right? But it's not like placenta like we think of placenta.
not mammalian.
Right. One of the other interesting ones is if you had to no, that's not a right word. If you had to smell garum or liquamen being made, you might be afraid to try it. Because the process of creating it is a little stinky. I learned from experience. I got the crazy idea one year that I was gonna make it at home. I have an acre worth of land, and I was gonna just do it on my backyard. I did it. I accomplished it. The liquamen was fantastic. And although I have an acre and my nearest neighbors are not, extremely close, they still asked me, please, in all neighborly kindness, to never make that on my property again. Because on certain days when the pot had to be stirred, the aroma could carry. Fortunately for me, I have a friend who lives deeper into the woods than I do, who has graciously offered me the use of their property for my next fermentation exercise. And we've built a raccoon-proof fermentation container for my fermentation projects.
So neighbors hated it, raccoons loved it.
Yes, they are drawn to the aroma where the neighbors hated it. Fun fact, it takes about 3 months to make a good batch of liquamen.
Ooh.
And liquamen is also garum, correct?
It is not. That is a common myth. Garum and liquamen, while they have the same initial components, are actually two distinct sauces. Garum is only ever used as a topping on already cooked foods. You don't see it cooked into things, right? You see garum being added as a condiment on top of things that have already been cooked. Liquamen, however, is cooked into things all the time. In fact, if you do any deep reading on Roman recipes, that you will find salt is hardly ever used as an ingredient in Roman cooking, where liquamen is used in almost everything. So
in the early books of people trying to cook Roman, before we had the Asian fish sauces that you can just buy in, Safeway today, they recommended anchovies or anchovy paste.
So anchovies and sardines form the basis for liquamen. Basically, how you make liquamen, and this is a really abbreviated version of the recipe, is you take your fermentation vessel and you pack it with layers of sea salt and gutted anchovies and sardines, and you just pack them up in layers. You put it in a nice warm place in direct sunlight. You put your lid on it. Occasionally you go out and stir it until everything sort of dissolves and makes a liquid, and then you filter the liquid as you drain it. Garum actually includes more fish than just sardines and anchovies. Garum is usually made with leftover bits of mackerel. It would include the blood and viscera, which you don't include in the making of liquamen. So garum, while they are both fermented fish sauces, they're distinct in what their component parts are and in how they're used. Liquamen gets used much more like table salt or even ketchup, where garum is like a finishing sauce. And part of our love-hate relationship with garum and liquamen, and are they the same thing, comes from unfortunate misunderstandings in early translations. For example, the Veiling translation of Apicius, he translates every reference to liquamen as broth. And broth and
Oh.
liquamen are not the same
Oh,
thing,
no.
right? They're not the same thing. So if you follow the Veiling translation, for both the Pullum oxyzomum and the chickpeas call for liquamen. If you followed the Veiling translation for that, and he was considered a pretty good translator at the time, but we're also talking, the 19th century, and there was lots of things we didn't know about Roman cookery then. We hadn't really translated the Geoponica yet, which is where most of our recipes for liquamen and garum come from. If you put broth in place of the liquamen in either of those dishes, you get a distinctly different dish.
Oh, yeah.
But it's because he didn't have the knowledge that we have now, that liquamen is actually a distinct ingredient item. It's not just broth of whatever kind.
Well, there's also a textile fiber kind of anecdote where a craft specialist remarked, archaeologists, lovely people, don't knit. So it's highly likely that the scholars who are doing the translation don't cook.
Oh yeah.
What translation, mine that I'm studying is the, I think it's Grocott and Granger. That's the one
That one's a pretty good one.
slogging through.
The Granger one is a pretty good translation. That's one of the most recent ones. If you use Veiling or Flowers and Rosenbaum, both of those texts have issues. So just be aware. And this is something I tell people in my redacting recipes class. Be aware whenever you use a translation, all translators bring their own biases to the table, right? So it's always helpful to consult more than one translation. I do my own translations. I still have copies of Granger and Veiling and Flowers and Rosenbaum because I am aware that I bring my biases to the table when I'm doing my translations. And also there's some words in Latin that have no direct translation in modern English. And sometimes some words in Latin can mean two different things depending on the context of the sentence that they're in. And since my day job isn't translating Latin, I'm always going to check my translations against my Latin English dictionary. I'm going to check it against other translators, because even if you are fluent in a language, if you're fluent in the modern language, it doesn't equate to being fluent in the ancient language. Modern French, for example, and medieval French have some words that no longer exist. There are words from medieval French that don't exist in modern French today. The same is true of Latin, modern Latin, ancient Latin, biblical Latin. They all have variations because language changes over time. And I never assume that because it's my translation, it's the best one. So I'm always checking my work against other people's work. I may not necessarily agree with that other translator's translation, but at least I'm looking at it as a way to check my own biases and check my perceptions of my translation.
That's one of the reasons why I like the Granger book, is that it's a bilingual edition. So you have their translation and the original and the cited sources of where they're getting that original from.
Well,
So
and I'll confess that I'm biased towards Granger because she is a cook, right?
Yes.
She was a cook before she was an archaeologist.
Wasn't she she was a patissier and then she went back to school to get degree?
Yes, she was a chef. She was asked to collaborate on some menus for the British Museum with Andrew Dalby, and based on the work that she did with him, she decided to go back to school and get a degree in archaeology.
Yep, her thesis was on garum.
Yes.
Which, yeah, I did not realize the difference between garum and liquamen, and I should have. So thank you.
Yeah, and So many researchers into Roman cuisine have just equated the two as being interchangeable terms, that it's one of those biases of Roman cookery that we just have to educate on, because most people just don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
as
and-
early as late as 2016, people were still calling garum and liquamen the same thing.
Yeah, and I have a strong desire to get it right and stay abreast, and that this was welcome news to me, and that explains a lot
Mhm.
about the construction of the different recipes.
The best translation we have right now for the Giapponica is by Andrew Dalby.
Yes, it's on my wish list.
Yeah. Yes. And Sally Granger's new book talks about it.
Yes, that's on my wish list too.
I got fortunate. I have a friend, I have several friends living overseas, and I mentioned how much it was to get it here, and they're like, oh, and they sent me a copy. So for which I'm eternally grateful, because it's less expensive in Britain than it is here.
Huzzah.
Nice. Well, I'm afraid I have to bow out, but thank you so much for doing this class. It was really cool.
Thank you all for coming. Like I said, I can talk about Roman food for hours and hours. So, but I should probably let you all go, because I'm sure you all have things you want to do this evening as well. I do post updates to my research to my website all the time. There's a couple of research papers up there right now, one about the archaeology of the Roman diet, one about middle-class Roman diet, and I'm currently working on a research project on recreating Roman wines. So I expect, hopefully by summer, to have some stuff to put up there about Roman wine making as well. So
Awesome.
Do you know an Ansteoran laurel? And now, of course, her SCA name has flown. Her modern name is Cynthia Siebel. Do you know her? Have you compared notes with her?
I have not yet. I'm talking to so many people. I'm like, is that one I know? I don't think that's one I know.
Okay.
I've talked to Lucia a little bit, because she's done some research on grapes.
It's Czina, Czina. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong.
I've heard of her, but I haven't had a chance to actually connect with her yet.
Oh, I'll ping you. She's a pal of mine.
Absolutely, I would love that. I am always
Yeah.
down for more people who want to talk about my geek.
And she did the garum in the garage. So,
Ew.
I'll connect you guys. She's
Awesome.
fantastic.
I love
Friend to all the neighborhood cats.
that.
I'm not sure how that went. I know that I tasted it. And she had done different varieties of it. Because there are different, it's not just the one only.
No. There's black garum and regular garum, and there's different varieties of garum, and then there's different qualities of garum.
And the stuff was really good.
Oh yeah. So the liquamen I made at home, I loved. You can get by with Thai fish sauce. You can actually technically get by with Worcestershire sauce, because it is actually made from fermented anchovies.
Anchovies, yeah.
But the thing that I will tell you about both Thai fish sauce and Worcestershire sauce is they add sugar to them. So they will slightly alter the final outcome of your dish. So as long as you're aware, it's going to make it a little sweeter than it otherwise would be.
I have 2.5 acres and I live way out in the country and I don't have close neighbors. But I probably won't be making my own liquamen this year.
I'm starting my own batch of liquamen in May.
So yeah, I will DM you tomorrow and see if I can get you and Sazina talking, at least just to compare notes on how you approach the fermentation process, because I think that's a cool thing. And thank you again, and I'm going to say good night now.
Thank you. It was
Emma.
wonderful talking to everyone.
Emma, thank you.
I'm going to say good night as well because I have a meeting with the East Coast at 7 a.m. their time.
Oh my, short night.
Yeah, it happens that way. Sometimes I'm a FOIA compliance officer, so sometimes I have to talk to people in other parts of the world.
Well, Fina, thank you so very much for taking the time to do this and preparing such a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry you don't have time to stay because many of us hang out here and chat for hours, and you could just rail on about your favorite passion all you'd like. But come back and join us another time.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so very much.
Good night.
And for those who are still hanging out, feel free to hang around. We can continue to talk about fermenting wonderfulness or cooking rodents or whatever project you're working on and whatever you'd like to do. I see we have
I know
some...
how bad fermenting cabbage smells. I'm not sure I'd want to have fermenting fish around. Yeah. We used the Thai fish sauce that actually an Italian fish sauce that billed itself as garum, but it had sugar in it. I posted the link to where our cookbooks show up.
I see that.
From our
Thank you for
feast,
that.
which has the dormice in it.
Which dormice? The whiskers and
Dormice made of Lucanian sausage, not
there you go.
real dormice.
I'm
But
game
we
for
had
this.
hummingbird tongues too. The
Oh,
hummingbird tongues were slices of chicken thigh
nice.
that we cooked in sweet and sour sauce. The had to have them. I mean, it's a Roman feast,
Yeah.
absolute requirement.
I see we have a new
But
I see we have a new person with us, Kat Perry. Where are you from, Kat? Anya, you're frozen and silent. Kat, where are you from?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I'm from Portland, Oregon.
Oh, well, I'm glad you joined us. Three Mountains, huh?
Yep.
Let's see if Anya's gotten her, Anya's motion again, so she can finish her chat about hummingbird tongues. I interrupted it.
I don't know. I'm okay on my end. Can
you froze and
not
were
see me
silent
or
there.
hear me?
You're doing okay right now.
Oh,
You were frozen.
okay. Yeah, the hummingbird tongues were just little skinny slices of chicken thigh and cooked in sweet and sour sauce. That's
Nice.
all. But had to have something like that for a Roman feast. I actually am the one who did the silphium chicken because I have a huge fennel plant that I think I grew the original. This is sort of a baby of the original, an offshoot. I grew the original back in like 2004.
Wow.
And the thing had gotten to be, I don't know, 2.5 foot across at the base of the clump when we moved. And the main part of it didn't survive being transplanted, but the smaller one did. And there's pictures up on the house capuchin stuff over, like in the spring and summer, of this monster fennel plant that went all the way to the bottom side of the eaves over the windows.
Wow.
Of the shop. Yeah, they get huge. And we've used like the seeds in making sausage and the blossoms as well. But the silphium chicken it's actually from Apicius. It must be that Persian silphium that she was talking about. I apparently have a not so good translation. Well, I know I have a not so good translation. The translation that I have of Apicius says that certain recipes use pumpkins. So that one doesn't quite work. But it requires hang powder, which is the asafoetida but a slightly milder asafoetida. And we cooked that in the shop, which wasn't the smartest thing. Thankfully, we opened the doorways and we had the fans going. But boy, that first blast when the hing powder hits the oil is amazing.
Not so great, huh?
There's a reason
Yeah.
the middle part of that word is fetid.
Yes. But the sauce, once you've got the fennel and everything else in there, is really yummy.
Yeah.
We pretty much what we did was we used chicken thighs. They're cheap. Rather than trying to bake a whole chicken in it, because a lot of the time it doesn't pick up the flavor. We just used chicken thighs and poured it over the top of those, and they turned out really, really good. There's somewhere, I actually found it, and now I'm sitting here going, why did I not put that one in there? There's a set of pictures from the event. I have to find it all over again because I managed to turn it off. Oh, blast, and then I dump it. Anyway, but we had fun with our feast. I think Roman feasts are just a tremendous amount of fun.
I think any feast is a tremendous amount of fun with the right attitude.
Yeah, there's
Yep.
that. The that was the one where we did the cap wrap. I just ran across that. One of our house members wrote a rap song about house captain, and
Oh my God.
we have several times, yes, and we've performed it several times, and it's really funny.
What a blast. Well, you were talking
Eventually,
about Go ahead.
eventually my computer will behave. It says you're in vibrant. Oh, and I got the wrong. Still
No
trying
rush.
to find the. I think I just finally have it opening. I hope. Is this the Roman feast?
I'm going to stop the recording for this meeting.